Hi YouTube, welcome to Your Car Care Companion. Today's video is on understanding how the engine works. Before I go into any description of how to perform service or maintenance procedures, it's very important to understand how the engine works. It makes it a lot easier to understand service procedures, and for safety reasons before working on a car, it's important to first have a basic understanding of how it works. So let's take a look at why that's valuable. So you might ask yourself, what's the value of understanding how my car works? Well, there are quite a few valuable reasons to understand how your car works. One, you can detect problems before they become serious. If you know how your car is supposed to sound, how it's supposed to move as it moves down this road, and that changes, that should give you an alarm that something's wrong and you need to check it or get it checked out. Also, when you understand the vehicle, you know that certain jobs cost more than others. And when you have that understanding, you don't have as much anxiety when you take it to the shop and it costs a lot of money to get certain jobs done. On the other side of that, understanding what jobs should not be expensive is also valuable, so that when you go to the shop to get a job done and it shouldn't be expensive, you know that as well. The other thing that's good about understanding and learning about your engine is you find that some of the tasks that you used to go to the shop for, you can now perform yourself and save a little money or a lot of money. And then finally, you have peace of mind, because the more you understand something, the less frightening it is. And my task and my goal is to demystify auto maintenance and the internal combustion engine so that people can understand them, not be afraid of them, and learn how to work on them themselves. There are basically three sections that make up an engine. The first section is the cylinder head, which is on top of the engine. The second section is the engine block that the cylinder head is mounted on top of. And the third is all of the components that make up the engine. And this is basically what you see when you open up your head. So let's first look at the cylinder head. What does the cylinder head do in its performance of its duties on the engine? Well, I'd like to draw an analogy. The cylinder head does the exact same thing that your head does. What is the most important thing that your head does on your body? More important than eating, more important than thinking. What does your head have to do first before anything else can be done? It breathes. Through your nose, through your mouth, in and out, your head breathes for your body, straight to your lungs. Well, the cylinder head on a car does the exact same thing. It has cams and valves and mechanical things that open and close, but basically its job is to breathe in fresh air and fuel, burn that fuel, let that fuel burn in the combustion chambers, and then open the exhaust valves and breathe out. And that is its job, basically. So, it's located on top, relatively speaking, of the engine block. Some vehicles, such as some models of Porsche and some models of Subaru, have the engine turned sideways, so it's basically on the side of the engine, but it's still, relatively speaking, on top of the engine block. So now, let's look at the engine block. So here we have two views of the engine block with the cylinder head removed. And we want to look at what is the job of the engine block. Well, it basically has three jobs. It has the combustion chambers here, these openings where the pistons go. It holds the pistons and the crank. The crank is at the bottom of the engine. And the pistons are connected to the crank by connecting rods. And we'll show that in another diagram later on. The engine block's job is to generate the power that runs the engine And as it generates that power, it gets very, very hot from the combustion. To keep it from overheating, to keep it cool, it has these openings that you see here along the top. The engine block, all these little openings here and all these little openings here. These are the openings through which the water pump pumps the coolant. It pumps the coolant back and forth from the radiator to the engine block and the cylinder head. The head also has these ports. And this is called the water jacket, and this is how the engine keeps from overheating. The coolant is pumped through these ports that wash all around the combustion chamber, gathers up the heat, takes it to the radiator, and dumps it. The engine peripheral component. Okay, so once you take your cylinder head and you put it on your block and you mount it down, you bolt it down, and you want to put your engine together, you have all of these peripheral components. So let's go through. The first one here is the power steering pump, and typically they look something like this. Here is the rear view of the water pump, which this is the impeller that actually turns via serpentine belt, and it forces that water through the water jacket and around to the radiator. Here's the front view of the water pump, a typical water pump, and the pulley that the serpentine belts turns mounts to this face here, and it goes around and it shoots out these pipes and circulates around the engine. Here's another serpentine belt driven component, the air conditioning compressor. And last but not least, the all important alternator, which generates the electricity. Once you put all these components on an engine, you get what we saw earlier, and I said we did discuss more, the completed engine with all the components installed that looks something like this. Okay, so once you have your engine all assembled and put together, you have to start it. Now years ago, some of the first Ford Model Ts were started with a human being cranking a handle. Well, that wasn't a very good idea because many times those engines would backfire. Those handles would spin back the other way and break the individual's arm. So they started to come up with a more convenient way to start the engine so you're not out in the rain cranking a handle and getting your arm broken. That is the electric starter. The electric starter here has two components. It has a little electric motor here, and it has an electronic solenoid. And it turns a very small gear here, a pinion gear, that engages with a larger gear here on the flywheel of the vehicle. Now the reason the flywheel is so big is because it's the same as having a long handle so that you have a lot of leverage. It makes it easy for the small motor to turn a large wheel like this to crank that big engine. And the way it works is the battery supplies power to the starter, and it goes through the starter, it goes to the solenoid, and the solenoid engages. It shoots this little gear out to engage the large gear. And then the starter motor starts to turn. It turns and cranks and cranks. And then when you let go of the key for the engine to run, this little gear pulls back the way this one is here, and disengages this large flywheel as the engine starts to turn too fast for the little motor. And then the motor runs, and the little electric motor, the engine runs, and the little electric motor just sits there. Its job is done. That's all the starter's job is to do, is to start the car. So once you have the engine all together, you have the head on top of the engine block, and you have all your peripheral components on. This is how the engine actually generates power. You have your pistons here. They go up and down in response to the explosions in the combustion chambers. They're connected to this crankshaft here that goes through the bottom of the engine. And they're connected by rods. We call these connecting rods here. And they're connected to the crankshaft. As they go up and down and crank that crankshaft, that is how power is generated in an engine. And the flywheel is connected in the back here. This flywheel section here is where the clutch is bolted, and housing that clutch and everything else is where the transmission goes.